Okay, so now we're going to talk about the cranial nerves, and there are 12 cranial nerves, and there are various mnemonics that you can use to help yourself remember them. Some of them are not, fit for prime time, and I'm going to ask you to kind of come up with some by the end of the week. But I want to give you a little overview to start with, to give you a sense of how to approach the study of and the the job of remembering what these various nerves do. First of all, it's important to realize that they share some features with the spinal nerves that we discussed, right? The sensory nerves, or the nerves that have sensory components, right? Actually will have the cell bodies of those neurons that are detecting whatever energy it is, whatever, sensation it's going to be transmitting, back into the CNS in the peripheral nervous system. So the same way you have the dorsal root ganglia for the sensory components of the spinal nerves, right? The sensory information traveling in spinal nerves, you're going to have ganglia that are found in the peripheral nervous system outside, the CNS that are going to be the source of the cell bodies for, the projections, the axons that are going to be heading in as part of those cranial nerves carrying sensory information, okay? And motor components of cranial nerves, and there are going to be some nerves that we'll discuss that are purely motor, they're going to have cell bodies in locations that are kind of analogous to the ventral horns in your spinal cord, remember, which are the source of the motor output. They're going to be nuclei in the brainstem that will subserve various motor output functions, right? Some cranial nerves we'll see, cranial nerve number 1 and cranial nerve number 2 are purely sensory. They're only carrying sensory information in, okay? While others, 3, 4, 6, 11, and 12 are purely motor. They only are what we call efferent. They are arising from neurons that are located in nuclei in the brainstem, and they consist of axons that are exiting, from various parts of the brainstem and coming out to move muscles, right? However, there are also what we call mixed nerves, mixed cranial nerves, which have both sensory and motor components. So they will have ganglia for the sensory components in the peripheral nervous system, and they will have nuclei in the brainstem that are the source of the efferent or motor output. And the mixed nerves include 5, right, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Now, 8, which is a particularly important cranial nerve, obviously, for this class, vestibulocochlear nerve, is sometimes described as a purely sensory nerve. And in some of the references, even some very good references, they describe it as a purely sensory nerve. But more recent evidence has suggested that there is also there are also some efferent components, some motor output to the cochlea, for example. And so I'm going to classify it for the purposes of this course as a mixed nerve. Now there are differences with spinal nerves. Cranial nerves tend to be a little bit more complex because they are actually carrying very specialized senses of the head and specialized motor control over the cranium. I should also mention that the first cranial nerve number 1, directly enters the telencephalon, or the brain, the cerebrum. And the second cranial nerve, the optic nerve, basically enters the diencephalon. It comes straight into the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, or the LGN of the thalamus, before projecting onto primary visual cortex. And the remaining cranial nerves enter and leave from the brainstem.